Amelia and Eric Richards are thrilled to welcome their newborn, Benjamin. But their joy is met with unexpected challenges at St. James Hospital. When tensions arise with certain staff members, the couple must fight for their rights and their son's well-being. What starts as a personal battle becomes a powerful journey of advocacy, revealing unexpected allies and sparking change that reaches far beyond their own family. Will their determination be enough to shift the tide and protect Benjamin? What truths emerge as they push for change, and who stands with them when it matters most? Stay with us as we explore this story of resilience, courage, and the transformative power of standing up for what's right. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that inspire and empower. Now, let's dive into their journey. The fluorescent lights in St. James Hospital glowed softly, casting a sterile, pale light that reflected off the polished linoleum floors. The early morning sun fought its way through thin slats in the blinds, sending thin bars of golden light across the room. The sounds of hospital life moved in a rhythmic ebb and flow, a distant beeping monitor, the soft tread of nurses' shoes, and the occasional muffled announcement over the intercom. Amelia Richards, a 32-year-old woman with dark wavy hair that clung to her damp forehead, gripped the cool metal of the hospital bed rails. The room smelled of antiseptic, sharp and clean, mingled with the faint aroma of coffee drifting in from the hallway. Sweat trickled down her temples as another contraction gripped her body, a fierce, consuming wave that left her breathless. She let out a low, guttural sound, squeezing her eyes shut as pain rippled through her core. "Amelia, you're doing amazing," said Eric Richards, her husband. His voice, deep and steady, broke through the haze of pain and brought her focus back to the present. His blue eyes were wide with concern, but held an unwavering encouragement. Eric, dressed in blue scrubs that didn't quite fit his tall frame, leaned close, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes. He squeezed her hand, his fingers warm and firm, grounding her as the storm raged within her. The delivery room was bustling but controlled, each nurse and doctor moving with a practiced ease that spoke of years of experience. Dr. Elaine Patterson, a seasoned obstetrician with graying hair tucked under a cap, stood at the foot of the bed, issuing calm, clear instructions. Her eyes, sharp and focused behind wire-rimmed glasses, met Amelia's for a brief second. "Amelia, on the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can," Dr. Patterson said, her voice both commanding and reassuring. Amelia nodded, her jaw tight as she prepared for the next wave. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the seconds elongating as her body strained under the effort. She felt Eric's hand tighten around hers, and she clung to it like a lifeline, drawing strength from the love she knew was in that touch. When the next contraction came, it was fierce and relentless. Amelia took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength she had left, and pushed. The air in the room thickened with anticipation, the quiet hum of machines underscoring the tension. And then, after what felt like an eternity, there was a sudden, sharp cry, a sound so pure and vital that it cut through the exhaustion and pain, filling the room with life. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, blurring her vision as the doctor lifted a small, wriggling bundle into her view. The baby's skin was flushed, his tiny fists flailing as he announced his arrival with a strong, healthy wail. "It's a boy," Dr. Patterson said, with a smile that softened her stern features. She handed the newborn to a nurse, who gently wrapped him in a soft white blanket before placing him on Amelia's chest. The warmth of his tiny body seeped into her, anchoring her in the moment. His eyes, dark and unfocused, opened for the briefest moment, and Amelia felt an unexplainable bond click into place. He was perfect, and he was hers. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The world outside the hospital room, with all its noise and chaos, faded to insignificance. There was only this, the soft weight of her son, the quiet awe in Eric's gaze as he leaned over to touch the baby's downy head, and the profound sense of love that filled every corner of the room. Eric's voice, rough with emotion, whispered, "Benjamin. Welcome to the world, Benjamin." As the first rays of dawn spread across the town of Hartford, casting a warm golden glow on the streets below, St. James Hospital was already alive with the steady pulse of activity. The maternity wing, a place meant to be filled with new life and hopeful beginnings, had an undercurrent of tension that only the keenest observers noticed. Amelia lay in her hospital bed, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away to leave a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Yet, even as fatigue draped over her like a heavy blanket, she couldn't stop staring at Benjamin, now swaddled tightly and sleeping in the bassinet beside her. The small room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beep of the monitor and the occasional murmur from the hallway. Eric stood by the window, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand, watching the sunlight filter through the blinds. He turned back to look at Amelia, a soft smile playing on his lips as he saw her gaze fixed on their son. "He's really here," he said, the wonder in his voice mirroring her own thoughts. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, placing his hand over hers. "How do you feel?" Amelia managed a tired laugh. "Like I've run a marathon, climbed a mountain, and fought a bear. All at the same time." Eric chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "Sounds about right." He glanced at Benjamin, his eyes softening. But it was worth it. Before Amelia could respond, a light knocks on the door drew their attention. A nurse entered, her movements precise and confident. Catherine Shore, one of the senior nurses known for her efficiency and strict adherence to protocol, stepped inside. Her uniform was immaculate, the crisp white of her cap stark against her graying hair, pulled into a severe bun. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Richards," Catherine said, her voice smooth but lacking the warmth one might expect in such moments. Her eyes, a pale gray, swept over the room, pausing briefly on Benjamin before she adjusted the clipboard in her hands. "I trust the night went well?" "Yes, it did," Eric replied, though the slight edge in his tone suggested he noticed the same coolness Amelia felt. Catherine nodded, though her expression did not change. "Excellent. We'll be performing some routine checks on the baby this afternoon. It's standard procedure to ensure his health." Amelia's hand moved instinctively to the bassinet, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed. Catherine's eyes flickered, a nearly imperceptible narrowing that hinted at impatience. Eric spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "We'd like to be with him during the tests." Catherine's smile was thin, a professional mask that did not reach her eyes. "Of course. However, for some parts of the examination, parents are usually asked to wait outside to maintain a sterile environment." A subtle tension settled over the room, and Amelia felt a prickle of unease she couldn't quite place. She nodded slowly, more to end the conversation than out of agreement. As Catherine turned and walked out, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hall, Amelia exchanged a glance with Eric. "What do you think of her?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing. Eric's brow furrowed slightly. "Efficient, but I don't know. There's something there. Don't worry, though. I'll make sure everything goes smoothly." Amelia nodded, but the unease remained, settling deep in her chest as she looked back at Benjamin's peaceful face. The hospital, once a place that symbolized safety and care, now felt slightly off-kilter, like a picture frame just askew. The first few hours after Benjamin's birth were a blur of exhaustion, joy, and fleeting moments of anxiety. Amelia lay back against her pillows, trying to will her body to relax. Each ache and throb reminded her of the effort it took to bring him into the world. But as she watched him sleep, every pain felt insignificant. The room was bathed in soft light from a corner lamp, and the sound of a passing cart in the hallway was the only intrusion. Eric was seated in the recliner, his long legs stretched out and his head leaning back as he dozed. He hadn't left her side all night, only stepping out for quick cups of coffee and to answer calls from excited relatives. Amelia smiled as she looked at him, the sharp lines of his usually serious face softened by sleep. The past few weeks had been hard on him too, balancing work, preparing for the baby, and managing his worry over her well-being. Now, in the quiet aftermath of labor, she felt a renewed appreciation for the way he anchored her. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts, and before she could respond, Nora Green, a young nurse with an easy smile and warm eyes, entered. She had been one of the few who stayed through the delivery, offering words of encouragement and moving with a grace that reassured Amelia during the most intense moments. "Good morning, Mrs. Richards," Nora said, her voice a soothing murmur as she approached the bed. She glanced at Benjamin, a genuine smile lighting her face. "And how's this little guy doing?" Amelia's tired eyes sparkled with a mix of pride and contentment. "He's perfect," she said, the words laced with awe. Nora's expression softened as she adjusted the blanket around Benjamin, her touch gentle and practiced. "He's got that healthy cry, I'll tell you that. And it's a good sign, means strong lungs." Amelia chuckled lightly, mindful not to wake Eric. "He sure does. I think we're in for some sleepless nights." Nora laughed quietly, a shared moment of understanding passing between them. She straightened, her smile fading slightly as her gaze shifted to the door where another nurse passed by. The shift in her demeanor was subtle but noticeable. Amelia caught the look and hesitated before speaking. "Nora, what do you think of Nurse Shore?" Nora's eyes widened briefly before she composed herself. She shifted her weight, considering her words. "Catherine has been here a long time. She's dedicated. She believes in keeping things by the book." The non-answer spoke volumes. Amelia's heart tightened with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "By the book," she repeated, testing the phrase on her tongue. Nora's gaze softened, and she leaned in slightly. "If you have any concerns, don't hesitate to voice them, Mrs. Richards. You're Benjamin's mother, and that means your instincts matter." A warmth spread through Amelia, dispelling some of the tension coiled in her chest. "Thank you, Nora. That means more than you know." Eric stirred as the morning light became brighter, casting streaks of gold across the pale green walls of the room. He blinked, disoriented for a moment before his eyes found Amelia's. A smile breaking across his face when he saw Benjamin still nestled safely beside her. "Morning," he said, stretching and wincing at the stiffness in his back. "Good morning," Amelia replied, her voice soft with a mixture of amusement and affection. "You slept like a rock." He chuckled, rubbing his neck. "Yeah, that chair is not exactly made for comfort." They shared a moment of quiet laughter before Eric's expression turned serious. He reached out and brushed a gentle hand over Benjamin's tiny fist, which twitched in response. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, as if to keep the weight of his worries from waking their son. "About the tests. I want to be sure everything's as it should be." Amelia's eyes met his, their shared concern palpable. "I know. I spoke to Nora this morning. She said it's okay to have questions, that we should trust our instincts." Eric nodded, the lines of tension around his mouth easing just a bit. "Good. We'll make sure we're there every step of the way." The door opened again, and Dr. Patterson stepped in, her demeanor relaxed yet professional. She offered a warm smile as she checked Amelia's chart. "How are we feeling today?" "Tired but happy," Amelia said, shifting slightly as Benjamin stirred in his sleep. Dr. Patterson's eyes sparkled behind her glasses. "That's what I like to hear." Benjamin's initial screenings were excellent, and we'll do a few more checks later to ensure everything's on track. "Nothing to worry about. It's all routine." Amelia nodded, trying to hold on to the reassurance in the doctor's voice. But even as she smiled, a flicker of anxiety lingered beneath the surface, small but persistent. The hours passed in a slow, steady rhythm. Nurses came and went, some stopping to coo over Benjamin, others moving with the brisk efficiency that defined their shifts. Catherine Shore reappeared just after noon, clipboard in hand and eyes as sharp as ever. She paused by the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room with the precision of someone who never overlooked a detail. "Mrs. Richards, it's time for Benjamin's checks," she announced, stepping inside with an air of authority. Amelia sat up, careful not to jostle Benjamin as she looked at Catherine. "Can we come with him?" she asked, the question laced with a calm determination. Catherine's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or impatience, before she masked it with a tight smile. "As I mentioned before, certain parts of the examination require a sterile environment. It's best for parents to wait outside." Eric stood up, his presence solid and unwavering beside Amelia. "We'd still like to stay as close as possible." Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. "You can wait just outside the viewing window. I assure you, Mr. and Mrs. Richards, we're taking every precaution for Benjamin's health." Amelia exchanged a glance with Eric, who nodded. They watched as Catherine approached the bassinet, her movements methodical as she lifted Benjamin with practiced care. For a moment, the room seemed colder, the soft cries of other babies in the maternity ward muted by the thudding of Amelia's heartbeat. "We'll be back shortly," Catherine said, her voice clipped as she turned and wheeled the bassinet toward the hallway. As the door clicked shut behind them, Amelia's chest tightened. She reached for Eric's hand, their fingers interlacing, and let out a shaky breath. "We're doing the right thing," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Eric squeezed her hand, the strength of his grip a silent promise. "Yes, we are." The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as Amelia and Eric stood outside the viewing window. The hallway was quieter than before, the bustle of the day having shifted into a more subdued rhythm. The muted sounds of a nurse's radio crackled from a distant corner, playing an old love song that only added to the tension simmering in Amelia's chest. She craned her neck to see into the examination room. The glass pane offered a clear view of Catherine Shore, who was methodically performing the tests on Benjamin. Other nurses moved in and out, their faces obscured by masks and caps, their movements efficient and detached. Eric noticed Amelia's knuckles whitening as she gripped the windowsill. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's okay," he said, but the words felt like they were meant as much for himself as for her. Amelia turned to look at him, searching his face for any cracks in the confidence he wore like armor. "I know," she whispered, but the anxiety buzzing under her skin made her doubt her own words. A soft knock behind them startled her, and they turned to see Nora Green standing there, holding a clipboard. Her eyes, warm and perceptive, softened when she saw the tension etched into Amelia's features. "I thought I'd check on you two," Nora said, her voice low. "These tests always feel longer than they are." Amelia nodded, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just hard watching from out here." Nora's gaze drifted to the examination room, where Catherine continued her work, her face set in an expression of focused detachment. "I know, but you're doing everything right by being here." Before Amelia could respond, Catherine stepped back from Benjamin, giving a brief nod to another nurse before moving toward the door. The sound of the handle turning made Amelia's heart leap into her throat. The door opened, and Catherine's eyes met theirs, her expression unreadable. "Benjamin is doing well," she said, her voice clipped but professional. All tests came back within normal ranges. The relief that flooded Amelia was almost dizzying, but it was quickly tempered by the faintly dismissive way Catherine's gaze shifted from her to the clipboard in her hands. Eric's jaw tightened beside her, but he said nothing. "Thank you," Amelia said, her voice trembling as she reached for Benjamin, who was handed back to her by one of the younger nurses. The warmth of his small body against hers was an immediate comfort, soothing the frayed edges of her nerves. Catherine's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, as she looked at the baby. But just as quickly, her mask of professionalism returned. "We'll continue monitoring him during your stay. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask." Amelia nodded, but as Catherine walked away, the sense of unease lingered. It wasn't the tests or the process itself that unsettled her. It was the fleeting moments where Catherine's facade slipped, revealing something Amelia couldn't quite name. Later that evening, the hospital settled into a quieter pace, the frenetic energy of the day giving way to the soft, rhythmic sounds of machines and the occasional murmur of conversation. Amelia sat up in her bed, Benjamin cradled in her arms. He was asleep, his tiny mouth making gentle sucking motions even in rest. Eric had stepped out to get some dinner, promising to bring back something better than the cold sandwiches left in the hospital's vending machine. The room felt both empty and full, filled with the joy of Benjamin's presence, but hollowed out by the echoes of earlier uncertainties. A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. Expecting Eric, she was surprised when Nora peeked in, her expression tentative. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, and when Amelia nodded, she stepped closer, her sneakers making barely a sound on the polished floor. "I wanted to see how you were holding up," Nora said, glancing at Benjamin and smiling. "He's precious." Amelia felt her shoulders relax at Nora's kind words. "Thank you. We're doing okay, I think." Nora's eyes searched Amelia's face, picking up on the unspoken tension. "It's normal to have questions, especially with your first baby. Sometimes the process can feel impersonal." Amelia swallowed hard, her fingers absently tracing the edge of Benjamin's blanket. "It did today, watching from the window. It was like he wasn't really ours in that moment." Nora sat down in the chair beside the bed, her face thoughtful. "Catherine's methods can be rigid, but that doesn't mean you can't ask questions or express your concerns. This is your baby, Amelia." Amelia nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of gratitude for Nora's presence. The young nurse's kindness was a welcome counterpoint to the cool professionalism of others. "I appreciate that, Nora." "Really?" Before Nora could respond, the door creaked open and Eric walked in, a takeout bag in hand and a smile lighting up his face when he saw Benjamin still resting peacefully. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, noting the warmth between Amelia and Nora. "Not at all," Nora said, standing up. "I was just checking in. I'll let you get back to your family time." As she walked out, she cast a glance back at Benjamin, a small secret smile playing at her lips. Amelia watched her go, the earlier unease settling deeper. There were moments here that felt right and moments that felt wrong, and she couldn't quite untangle them yet. That night, the hospital room was bathed in the soft bluish glow of the monitor's screen. Eric sat in the recliner once more, his dinner half-eaten on the small tray table. Benjamin was tucked into the bassinet, his gentle breathing a rhythmic reminder of the life they had brought into the world. Amelia shifted, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion that pressed on her eyelids. She looked at Eric, who noticed her movement and turned to meet her gaze. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice a whisper that blended with the soft hum of the air vent. She shook her head. "It's just, today was strange, wasn't it?" Eric sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Yeah, it was. Catherine is something, but Benjamin is healthy, and that's what matters." Amelia nodded, but the nagging feeling persisted. "I just felt like there was more going on. Like we weren't being told everything." Eric reached for her hand, his touch reassuring. "If anything feels off, we'll find out. We're in this together." The silence that followed was heavy with unsaid words, the kind of silence that made the shadows seem deeper and the night longer. But even in that silence, the sound of Benjamin's breathing was a constant, grounding them both. As the first light of morning began to edge over the horizon, Amelia finally closed her eyes, hoping that with daylight would come clarity, and perhaps some peace. The morning came slowly, light seeping into the hospital room in thin golden rays that painted soft patterns on the walls. Amelia's eyes fluttered open, her body heavy with exhaustion. She glanced at the bassinet where Benjamin lay, still asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each soft breath. A sense of fragile peace settled over her, but it was fleeting. Eric had already woken and was seated in the chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot below. His shoulders were tense, the lines of worry etched into his face even in the soft light of dawn. "You're up early," Amelia said, her voice hoarse from sleep. He turned, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, couldn't sleep much. Just kept thinking about yesterday." Amelia nodded, understanding the unspoken worry. They both knew that being first-time parents came with a mix of fears and questions. But there was something else in the air, something less tangible but no less real. A knock at the door drew their attention. Dr. Patterson entered, her demeanor relaxed but attentive. She glanced at Benjamin with a smile that was genuine and reached Amelia's heart. "Good morning, Richard's family. How are we doing today?" she asked, moving to check the chart hanging by the bassinet. "Better now that he's here with us," Amelia said, offering a tired smile. "Good to hear," Dr. Patterson replied, her tone reassuring. "Benjamin's tests yesterday looked excellent. He's a healthy, strong little boy." Eric's eyes shifted, the tension easing slightly. "Thank you, Doctor. We appreciate everything." Dr. Patterson's eyes flicked between them, noting their guarded expressions. She paused, her smile fading slightly. "I know being here can feel overwhelming, especially with the way procedures are handled. If there's anything you're unsure about, don't hesitate to ask. That's what we're here for." Amelia felt a warmth bloom in her chest. It was the first time since Benjamin's birth that someone had spoken with such openness. "We'll remember that. Thank you." As Dr. Patterson left the room, the air felt lighter, but the shadow of unease lingered at the edges, a reminder that trust could be fragile. Amelia spent the rest of the morning caring for Benjamin, who now stared up at her with dark, unfocused eyes that seemed to take in the world anew with each blink. Eric moved around the room, tidying up the space and checking his phone for updates from their family, who were anxiously waiting for news and pictures. Nora appeared at the doorway, her expression brightening when she saw Benjamin's alert face. "He's a curious one already," she said, stepping inside with a small bottle of prepped formula in hand. Amelia laughed softly. "He is. It's like he's trying to figure us out." Nora's smile turned wistful. "They do that. Babies know more than we think." Eric glanced at the clock, then at Nora. "Have you worked with Nurse Shore long?" he asked, the question casual, but carrying an undertone that Amelia recognized. Nora's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Yes, quite a while now. She's been here longer than most of us. Very experienced." She paused, her eyes flicking to Amelia and then back to Eric. "But experience isn't everything. People bring their own approaches to this work." Amelia's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Nora hesitated, as if weighing her words. "Just that everyone here has a different way of showing care. Some do it with warmth, others with procedure. It's important to know that you can always ask for clarity if you need it." The implication hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eric stepped closer to Benjamin, his hand resting on the bassinet as if to shield him from any lingering doubt. "We appreciate that, Nora." She nodded, her eyes kind but cautious. "I'll be around if you need me. And don't hesitate to press the call button." As Nora left, the room fell into silence, broken only by the soft coos of Benjamin and the faint murmur of voices in the hallway. Amelia met Eric's gaze, the concern in her eyes mirroring his own. They weren't just new parents trying to learn the ropes. They were parents trying to understand what, or who, could be trusted. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting long beams through the slats in the window blinds. Eric had stepped out to make a call, leaving Amelia alone with Benjamin. She watched him, captivated by the tiny movements of his hands and the occasional quiver of his lips. A sharp rap at the door startled her. Catherine Shore stood there, her silhouette framed by the fluorescent hallway lights. She stepped inside, clipboard clutched to her chest as she surveyed the room. "Mrs. Richards," she began, her voice firm and impersonal, "we'll need to do one final set of checks before you and Benjamin are discharged tomorrow." Amelia nodded, the familiar prickle of unease stirring in her chest. "Can Eric and I stay with him during the checks?" Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a brief moment her composed mask slipped. "Parents often find it difficult to remain objective during medical procedures. It's best if we handle this part alone." Amelia's heartbeat quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd prefer to be there." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, the shadow of something unreadable flickering there before she looked back down at her clipboard. "As you wish. We'll make an exception." Her tone made it clear that exceptions were not usually her preference. As Catherine turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. "It's important that you trust the people caring for your child, Mrs. Richards. Doubt can complicate what should be a simple process." The words, though spoken without inflection, settled over the room like a warning. Amelia swallowed hard as the door clicked shut behind Catherine, leaving her alone with the steady sound of Benjamin's breathing and a deepening sense of resolve. When Eric returned, he found Amelia pacing the room, her eyes distant and filled with worry. He set down the bag of essentials he'd picked up from home and crossed to her, his concern immediate. "What happened?" he asked, his voice edged with tension. Amelia stopped, turning to him with a look that spoke of both fear and determination. Catherine came by. She said we could be there for the tests tomorrow, but the way she said it— Eric, something isn't right. Eric's jaw tensed, his protective instinct flaring. We'll be there, Amelia. Every step of the way. No one is taking our involvement away from us. She nodded, but the look in her eyes didn't soften. I don't know what it is, but I feel like we need to be ready. Just in case. He reached out, cupping her face with one hand and meeting her gaze with unwavering confidence. We are ready, and we'll protect Benjamin no matter what. Amelia leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his resolve. The small, sterile room around them felt suffocating, but with Eric's reassurance, she felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone in this. They had each other, and that would have to be enough to face whatever came next. The morning of Benjamin's last tests arrived with a thin veil of clouds drifting across a pale blue sky. The hospital room felt more confined than ever, the anticipation thick in the air. Amelia adjusted Benjamin's blanket, her fingers trembling as she tucked it around him. Eric stood beside her, his presence steady but shadowed by concern. Nora entered the room, her smile soft but genuine. Good morning, you two. Ready for the big day? Amelia nodded, her throat tight as she tried to push down the gnawing worry. As ready as we'll ever be. Nora's eyes flickered with understanding. I'll be there to help with the tests. Just so you know, you're not alone. Amelia's relief was immediate, a small but vital comfort. Thank you, Nora. Before more could be said, the door swung open and Catherine Shore stepped in, her expression as composed as ever. Behind her, a young nurse wheeled in a tray with instruments neatly arranged, the sterile metal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Mr. and Mrs. Richards, we're ready to begin, Catherine said, her eyes moving from Benjamin to Amelia and then to Eric. Please follow us to the examination room. The walk down the hallway felt endless, every step amplifying Amelia's heartbeat until it drummed in her ears. They entered a larger, brightly lit room with medical monitors and cabinets filled with supplies. Catherine gestured to a cushioned bench where Amelia and Eric could sit. Nora stood by the table, her eyes offering a silent reassurance as Catherine prepared Benjamin for the first part of the test. The baby stirred, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching as if sensing the tension in the room. Catherine's hands moved with practiced precision, but her expression remained unreadable. This will take some time, she said, glancing at Eric and Amelia. We'll begin with standard vitals and then proceed to more specific assessments. Amelia's eyes never left Benjamin, her breath catching each time he squirmed or let out a small cry. Eric reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a silent show of solidarity. The machines beeped in steady rhythms, each sound a reminder of the stakes at hand. As the tests continued, a shift in the atmosphere became palpable. Catherine's manner was efficient, yet there was an edge to her movements, a tightness in her jaw that Amelia couldn't ignore. The younger nurse beside her worked in silence, occasionally glancing at Nora for cues. At one point, Benjamin began to cry, the soft, plaintive sound breaking through the tension. Amelia instinctively moved to stand, her maternal instinct urging her to soothe him. Catherine's eyes snapped to her, the shadow of irritation flaring momentarily. Mrs. Richards, please remain seated. This is a controlled procedure, Catherine said, her voice controlled but sharp. Eric's eyes narrowed as he straightened in his chair. He's our son. If Amelia wants to comfort him, she will. The room fell silent, the beeping of the machines now a stark backdrop to the confrontation. Catherine's lips thinned, but she nodded curtly. Very well. Just ensure that it does not interfere with the test. Amelia stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Benjamin's tiny chest, her touch softening his cries. Nora exchanged a glance with her, a brief, silent message of support. Eric's jaw relaxed, but his eyes stayed on Catherine, watching her carefully as she resumed her work. There was an unspoken understanding between him and Amelia now. They would no longer sit by passively. Whatever was happening here, they would face it head-on. The tests ended an hour later and Catherine stepped away, scribbling on her clipboard. She spoke with the young nurse in low tones before turning back to the room. Benjamin's results will be reviewed, and we'll inform you of the next steps," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Without waiting for a response, she left, her heels clicking down the hallway. The silence she left behind was heavy, punctuated only by the soft whimpering of Benjamin, who had finally settled. Nora approached, her gaze filled with both empathy and something else, worry. "You did well," she said to Amelia, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you." Eric stood, stretching his back and letting out a sigh. "Nora, if there's something we need to know, something we're missing, please tell us." Nora hesitated, her eyes shifting to the hallway before she nodded slowly. "Meet me in the break room in 10 minutes. We need to talk." Amelia's pulse quickened as she exchanged a look with Eric. Whatever was happening, they were about to find out more. The break room was quiet, a worn coffee machine humming softly in the corner. A few chairs were scattered around a small table, their plastic surfaces faded from years of use. Nora sat with her hands clasped, eyes fixed on a spot on the floor as if gathering her thoughts. When Amelia and Eric entered, she looked up, her expression serious. "There are things I can't say directly," Nora began, her voice cautious. "But I've seen patterns here that don't always align with what I believe is best for the patients." Eric frowned, crossing his arms. "Patterns? What do you mean?" Nora glanced toward the door as if to make sure they were alone. "Catherine Shore is a good nurse in terms of skill, but she has her own ideas about what's best for certain families. Sometimes those ideas cross boundaries that shouldn't be crossed." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying she's targeting us? Why?" Nora sighed, looking genuinely pained. "Not just you. It's subtle, but she holds beliefs about who she thinks deserves certain levels of care. It's not policy, it's personal." Eric's jaw clenched, the muscles working as he tried to absorb the implications. "So what do we do now?" "Stay vigilant," Nora said. "You have every right to be present, to ask questions, and to push back if something doesn't feel right. And you're not alone in this. Some of us are watching, too." Amelia's eyes glistened, a mix of relief and anxiety pooling in them. "Thank you, Nora. We needed to hear that." Nora's smile was small but genuine. "Take care of your boy. He's lucky to have parents who won't give up on him." As they left the break room, the weight of what they had learned settled heavily over them. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They would protect Benjamin with everything they had, no matter who stood in their way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridors, creating patterns that shifted as people moved by. Eric paced the hallway outside their room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He had called his brother, who was a lawyer, not to take immediate action, but to gather information, just in case. Amelia sat in the room with Benjamin resting peacefully in her lap, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing soothing some of her nerves. Still, Nora's words replayed in her mind, looping with a persistent unease. What did it mean that some staff believed certain families were treated differently? The implications felt too vast, too insidious to ignore. A soft knock at the door drew her out of her thoughts. A young red-haired nurse named Kelly peeked in, offering a tentative smile. Kelly had been a familiar face during Amelia's stay, often coming by to chat or check on them when her shift allowed. "I heard Benjamin had his final tests today," Kelly said, stepping inside. "How did it go?" Amelia's smile felt strained as she met Kelly's curious gaze. "He did well, but it's been stressful." Kelly nodded, her eyes softening. "It always is for new parents. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask." Amelia glanced at Benjamin, whose tiny hand had found the edge of her shirt and gripped it tightly, as if sensing her unease. "Actually, Kelly, can I ask you something? Do you know much about Nurse Shore's reputation here?" Kelly's expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face before she answered. "Catherine is respected. She's experienced, but some find her methods a bit old school, if you know what I mean." Amelia nodded slowly, sensing the weight of what Kelly left unsaid. "Thank you. That helps." Kelly reached out, touching Amelia's arm lightly. "Just trust yourself. You know what's best for Benjamin." As Kelly left, the room fell into silence again. Eric returned moments later, his brow knit with determination. "Spoke to Daniel," he said, referring to his brother. "He said we should document everything. If we notice anything off, or if anyone acts out of line, write it down. It may not come to that, but I'd rather be prepared." Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "We're not just new parents, Eric. We're fighting for Benjamin's place in a system that's supposed to protect him. It's overwhelming." Eric sat beside her, placing a hand on Benjamin's back. "I know, but we're not going to let anyone undermine that. Not now, not ever." The maternity wing was quieter as the day turned to evening, the lull between visiting hours bringing a rare calm. Nurses moved with quieter steps, and the gentle murmur of conversations seeped through partially closed doors. Amelia noticed Catherine speaking in low tones to another nurse near the end of the hallway. The light above them flickered, casting shadows that played across their faces, making it difficult to read their expressions. But there was an air of urgency in Catherine's gestures, her fingers tapping against her clipboard with a staccato rhythm that spoke of frustration. Eric caught Amelia's glance and followed her line of sight. His jaw tightened when he saw Catherine, but he said nothing. They both knew they needed to tread carefully. Confrontation without cause could backfire, eroding any credibility they needed to maintain. "Let's go for a walk," Eric suggested, his voice low. "It'll do us good to get out of this room for a few minutes." Amelia nodded, carefully placing Benjamin in the bassinet before stepping out with Eric. The hallway felt both familiar and unfamiliar, every nurse's glance a potential hint or reassurance. As they walked, they passed the break room. The door was ajar, and inside they could see Nora and Kelly speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions were serious, brows furrowed as if discussing something important. Amelia slowed, meeting Nora's eyes as she glanced up. A brief, knowing look passed between them, and Nora gave a slight nod before turning back to Kelly. The gesture, though small, felt like a promise. Someone else was watching, someone who understood. That night, after they settled back into the room and the hospital quieted with the shift change, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was Dr. Benson, the head of the maternity department, a tall man with graying hair and a commanding but kind presence. His visits were rare and typically reserved for exceptional circumstances. "Mr. and Mrs. Richards," he began, stepping inside. His eyes moved from Amelia to Eric, then to Benjamin, who was now sleeping soundly. "I wanted to check in personally and discuss the outcome of today's tests." Amelia's heart thudded in her chest as she exchanged a look with Eric. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Benson's face softened, and he nodded. "Yes, Benjamin's results are as expected for a healthy newborn. But I've heard there's been some concern about procedures and communications during your stay." Eric's expression tightened, but he remained calm. "We appreciate the thoroughness of the care, but there have been moments where we felt out of the loop or questioned." Dr. Benson's eyes darkened with understanding. "I apologize for any discomfort. It's important that parents feel heard, especially during such a critical time. If there's anything specific you'd like to address, my door is always open." Amelia's eyes welled with sudden, unexpected emotion. The tension she'd been carrying loosened a fraction. "Thank you, Dr. Benson. That means a lot." As he left, the door closed with a quiet click, leaving behind a sense of tentative relief. It was a reminder that there were still people within the hospital who valued open dialogue and empathy. But the subtle tensions, the whispered warnings, and the rigid stances were far from resolved. The room was bathed in the soft, ambient light from the window as night settled over the hospital. Eric leaned back in the recliner, one leg crossed over the other as he rubbed his temples. Amelia sat on the bed, Benjamin cradled in her arms, his breathing a steady reassurance against her chest. "Do you think Dr. Benson's visit changes anything?" Eric asked, breaking the silence. Amelia considered the question, her fingers tracing small circles on Benjamin's back. "It's a step in the right direction, but we still need to stay alert. We know more now, thanks to Nora, but it's not enough to stop worrying." Eric's gaze softened as he looked at her, seeing the strength that had carried them through these past few days. We're getting through it, though, and we have people on our side, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Amelia nodded, her eyes drifting to the bassinet, then back to Eric. As long as Benjamin is safe, we'll face whatever comes. The quiet stretched between them, not heavy, but charged with a shared understanding. They were parents, guardians, fighters, whatever the role required. And as the minutes slipped into hours, they knew that their vigilance was more than justified. Tomorrow would bring another day, more questions, and perhaps answers. But tonight, as the soft hum of the hospital cradled them, they found solace in their resolve. The sun rose slowly over the town, casting a warm golden hue over St. James Hospital. Inside, the morning buzz had already begun. Nurses exchanged shift reports, patients were tended to, and the sounds of monitors beeped steadily. In room 207, however, a different kind of tension was brewing. Amelia sat on the edge of her bed, her gaze fixed on the soft bundle in the bassinet. Benjamin's tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, the rhythmic movement offering her a fleeting moment of peace. Eric was by the window, his eyes distant as he watched the world outside, deep in thought. The soft knock on the door made them both turn. Nora stepped in, her expression concerned but resolute. "Morning, Richards family," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency. She closed the door behind her, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "What's going on?" Eric asked, his posture straightening. Nora took a deep breath. "I thought you should know that there's been talk about today's follow-up. Catherine has requested to oversee it, and there's been tension about it among the staff." Amelia's heart tightened, the anxiety that had simmered now bubbling to the surface. "Why would she insist on being there?" she whispered, her mind racing with possibilities. Nora's eyes met Amelia's, a quiet intensity in them. "I don't know for sure, but whatever happens, remember, you have the right to advocate for your child. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Eric's jaw clenched as he exchanged a look with Amelia. "We won't." The hallway outside the examination room was bustling, a mix of nurses and doctors moving through their morning routines. Amelia cradled Benjamin, his tiny body warm and reassuring in her arms, while Eric stood beside her, a silent fortress of support. They could see Catherine through the glass window, preparing the equipment with practiced efficiency. When the door opened, Catherine's eyes settled on them, her expression unreadable. "Are we ready?" she asked, her tone neutral, but carrying an edge that made Amelia's skin prickle. "We're here to observe, as agreed," Eric said, his voice calm but firm. Catherine nodded curtly and gestured for them to step inside. The examination room was brightly lit, the sterile scent of disinfectant filling the air. A young nurse adjusted a monitor, avoiding eye contact as Catherine began the process. The minutes dragged on, marked by the soft beeping of machines and Benjamin's occasional fussing. Amelia watched every movement, her body tense with an instinct she couldn't ignore. Catherine's face remained impassive as she worked, but there was a rigidity in her shoulders that spoke of something more. When Benjamin let out a louder cry, Amelia instinctively reached for him. Catherine's eyes flicked up, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "He's fine, Mrs. Richards. Please remain patient." Amelia's hand paused midair, but she drew herself up, meeting Catherine's gaze with steady defiance. "I know my son, and I won't ignore when he needs me." A moment of silence passed, and in that pause, a tension crackled through the room. Catherine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing as she continued the exam. Nora, standing by the doorway, shifted her weight, her expression one of quiet encouragement. The tests concluded with Catherine noting results on her clipboard, her pen moving with sharp, deliberate strokes. She handed the notes to the young nurse without another glance at Amelia or Eric. "That will be all," she said, her voice clipped. "The results will be available shortly." Amelia's eyes narrowed, a wave of protectiveness surging in her chest. "Before we go, I'd like to ask some questions about what comes next." Catherine paused, the muscles in her jaw tightening. "Questions can be addressed at the next consultation. Right now, we have other patients to attend to." Eric stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed her. "We understand you're busy, but we need clarity. This is about our son, and we won't be brushed aside. Nora cleared her throat softly. Perhaps I can arrange a time for you to meet with Dr. Benson for further discussion? Catherine's eyes flicked to Nora, a brief glare that didn't go unnoticed. But before she could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Benson himself entered, his expression calm, but assessing. Is there an issue? He asked, looking from Catherine to the Richards. Amelia felt her pulse quicken. No issue, just making sure we understand what's happening moving forward. Dr. Benson's gaze lingered on Catherine for a moment before he nodded. That's fair. Let's set up a time for a thorough discussion. In the meantime, rest assured that Benjamin's care is our top priority. Catherine's silence was heavy as she gathered her things and left the room. The air felt lighter once she was gone, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. Eric turned to Dr. Benson. Thank you. We need transparency, especially now. Dr. Benson inclined his head, his voice steady. You'll have it. I'll see you later this afternoon. Amelia and Eric returned to their room, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them. Benjamin, now settled back in his bassinet, looked peaceful, unaware of the struggle unfolding around him. Amelia sank into the chair beside the window, the light catching on her tired eyes. Why does everything feel like a battle? She whispered, her voice edged with exhaustion. Eric sat beside her, taking her hand in his. Because it is, but we're not alone. Nora, Dr. Benson, they're on our side. A knock on the door brought them out of their moment. Nora stepped in, a small smile on her face. I thought you might like some tea, she said, holding up 2 cups. And I wanted to check in. Amelia accepted the cup with a grateful nod. Thank you, Nora, for everything. Nora's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. You're welcome. And just remember, no matter what happens, you're doing right by Benjamin. As Nora left, Amelia felt a flicker of hope break through the fatigue. They weren't just navigating these challenges blindly. They were supported, and that made all the difference. Eric's eyes met hers, filled with determination. We're ready for whatever comes next. Amelia nodded, the strength in their unity fortifying her resolve. They would protect their son, face every challenge head-on, and ensure that their voice was not just heard, but respected. The hospital lobby was busier than usual as Amelia and Eric made their way to Dr. Benson's office. Voices overlapped in a symphony of conversation, punctuated by the soft whir of wheelchairs and the beep of monitors. The sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, a sharp reminder of their surroundings. Amelia's heart pounded as they reached the office, the brass nameplate on the door reading, Dr. Walter Benson, Chief of Maternity. Eric glanced at her, squeezing her hand for reassurance before they stepped inside. The room was spacious but understated, with framed certificates and photographs of Dr. Benson shaking hands with various medical professionals. The doctor sat behind his desk, reading over a file before he looked up and offered a welcoming smile. Please, come in, he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of him. He closed the file, his eyes flicking briefly to Benjamin, who was swaddled and cradled in Eric's arms. How's our little patient today? Resting, Eric said, shifting slightly so Amelia could sit beside him. The warmth in Dr. Benson's tone was a comfort, but the tension in the room was still palpable. Dr. Benson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I wanted to talk to you both to ensure we're addressing your concerns. I understand that yesterday's procedures were challenging. Amelia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. We felt shut out at times, and while we appreciate the thorough care, some of the interactions have left us worried. Dr. Benson nodded, his expression serious. I'm aware that Nurse Shore can come across as rigid. She has a long history with this hospital, but that doesn't mean every approach she takes is the right one. Eric's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why allow it? Why put families through the stress of second-guessing the care they're receiving? The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Dr. Benson sighed, glancing down at his hands. Hospitals run on trust and tradition, sometimes to a fault. But I'm here to tell you that your concerns are being heard. We're looking at implementing changes to ensure a more collaborative approach between staff and parents. Amelia felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by a lingering doubt. Does that mean Catherine will change how she handles cases? Dr. Benson's gaze shifted, a glimmer of frustration crossing his features. It means we're going to review the processes and ensure all staff align with the hospital's standards of patient care and family engagement. If there are any deviations, they will be addressed. Leaving Dr. Benson's office, Amelia and Eric felt a cautious optimism take root. The conversation had been promising, but the real test would be in what came next. As they walked back to their room, they passed Catherine in the hallway. Her eyes met theirs briefly, cool and distant, before she moved on, clipboard held tightly against her chest. The encounter left Amelia unsettled. The look Catherine gave them wasn't one of defeat or reconsideration, it was one of quiet calculation. It was as if she was already planning her next move, adapting to the changing dynamics around her. Eric noticed her expression and leaned in. "We'll keep an eye out. She's not going to push us around." Amelia nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I know, but we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The next morning, as Amelia fed Benjamin and Eric gathered their belongings in preparation for discharge, Nora stepped in. Her usual smile was tinged with an air of urgency. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, glancing at the hallway before closing the door behind her. Eric stopped what he was doing, crossing his arms as he gave Nora his full attention. "What's going on?" "There's been talk," Nora said, her voice hushed. "Catherine isn't taking yesterday's confrontation lightly. She's spoken with some staff, and while I can't say for certain what her next steps are, I'd be cautious about who you trust." Amelia's heart skipped a beat, the sense of security they'd felt slipping away. Why would she involve other staff? What could she gain from that? Nora's eyes softened with empathy. For some, it's about control, maintaining a reputation, asserting authority. But you have allies here. If anything happens, we're here to help. Eric exchanged a look with Amelia, a silent agreement passing between them. "Thank you, Nora," he said. "We appreciate everything you're doing." Nora's smile was small but sincere. "You're not alone in this, and don't let anyone make you feel like you are." Discharge day arrived with a mix of relief and apprehension. The paperwork was signed, and Benjamin's tiny bag was packed with the essentials for his first day at home. Eric held the car seat, adjusting the straps as Amelia placed Benjamin inside, her hands moving with a mix of confidence and nervousness. The final check was completed by a younger nurse, who gave them instructions and a warm smile. "Congratulations, Richard's family. You're all set to go home." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes, a rush of gratitude filling her chest. But as they turned to leave, Catherine appeared at the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Leaving already?" she asked, the question carrying an edge that made Amelia's stomach twist. Eric nodded, his eyes locked on hers. "Yes, we are. Thank you for your care." Catherine's smile was tight. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." "Take care." The implication hung in the air as they walked past her, the weight of her words pressing on their minds. Outside, the cold winter air was a stark contrast to the warmth of the hospital, the sharpness waking them to the reality they faced. Eric placed the car seat in the back, fastening it securely before getting into the driver's seat. Amelia settled in beside him, glancing back at Benjamin, who was already dozing off. "We did it," she said softly, a mix of triumph and exhaustion coloring her voice. Eric nodded, starting the car. "Yes, we did. But this isn't over. We need to stay vigilant." Amelia reached for his hand, squeezing it as they pulled out of the parking lot. The road ahead, both literal and metaphorical, was uncertain. But for now, they were together, ready to face whatever came next. The drive home was filled with a mix of anticipation and cautious relief. The town of Hartford passed by in a blur, its streets lined with familiar storefronts and the late winter chill that seemed to seep into everything. Amelia's eyes stayed fixed on Benjamin through the rearview mirror, her heart steadying with each peaceful rise and fall of his tiny chest. Eric reached for her hand as they stopped at a red light, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "We're home now," he said, his voice firm yet tender. "This is our space where we call the shots." Amelia smiled faintly, nodding as the light changed and they rolled forward. Their house, a small two-story nestled at the end of a quiet street came into view. The sight of it, a place filled with memories and new beginnings, brought a rush of emotion. As they pulled into the driveway, Amelia felt the weight of the past few days settle into a manageable place. The battles weren't over, but at least for now, they had the comfort of home. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, smelling faintly of lavender from the sachets Amelia always kept in the linen closet. They set Benjamin in his crib, the soft fabric of his blankets wrapping around him as he stirred, eyes fluttering before drifting back to sleep. Eric leaned against the doorway, watching Amelia as she brushed a finger lightly over their son's cheek. "We'll protect him, whatever it takes," he said, a quiet promise that resonated in the room. Amelia turned, her eyes meeting his. "We will." The days that followed were a blend of sleepless nights and tentative joy. Friends and family came by with gifts and warm meals, filling their home with laughter and a semblance of normalcy. But beneath it all, Amelia and Eric stayed vigilant, their minds turning over the details of their hospital stay. Questions buzzing like static at the back of their thoughts. One evening, after they'd put Benjamin down for the night, Eric sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open and a notepad filled with scrawled notes beside it. Amelia joined him, a steaming mug of chamomile tea in her hands. "What are you working on?" she asked, peering at the screen. "Documentation," Eric said, eyes scanning an email. "Daniel sent over some advice on how to compile everything. If we need to make a formal complaint or escalate things, we'll have a record of what happened." Amelia set her mug down, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "We need to be prepared. If Catherine is influencing how things are done at St. James, we can't let that stand." Eric nodded, his expression serious. "I've been researching too. It turns out there have been murmurs about her before, but nothing ever came of it. We might not be the first family she's made uncomfortable." The implication hung in the air, solidifying their resolve. They weren't just advocating for Benjamin, they were standing up for every parent who felt they couldn't. A week later, a knock at the door startled them from their evening routine. Eric opened it to find Nora standing there, bundled against the cold with a hesitant smile. "Nora," Eric said, surprised. "Come in." She stepped inside, shivering slightly as the warmth enveloped her. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, glancing at Amelia, who joined them in the entryway. "Not at all," Amelia said, a mix of curiosity and gratitude in her voice. "Is everything okay?" Nora's expression turned serious as she unbuttoned her coat. "I came by because I wanted you to hear it from me first. There have been quiet conversations among the staff. Some of us believe that your case might be the push we need to bring attention to practices that have been ignored for too long." Amelia's breath caught. "You mean Catherine's methods?" Nora nodded, her eyes flicking to Benjamin's room before settling back on them. "Exactly. There's a shift happening, but it needs a catalyst. If you choose to move forward with a formal report, you'll have support." Eric exchanged a look with Amelia, the weight of Nora's words sinking in. They had allies, and not just Nora. This was bigger than their family. It was about fostering a culture of trust and compassion in a place that was supposed to embody those values. "Thank you, Nora," Eric said, his voice steady. "We're not backing down." Nora's smile returned, small but genuine. "I didn't think you would." The next day, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, a blank document open on her laptop. The soft sounds of Benjamin's cooing from the living room filtered through, grounding her as she gathered her thoughts. She began to type, each word deliberate and heartfelt. This wasn't just a formal complaint, it was a narrative of what they had experienced and a call for accountability. The letter outlined their encounters with Catherine, the subtle warnings from staff, and the moments that eroded their trust. Eric joined her halfway through, reading over her shoulder and adding his insights. By the time they finished, the letter was long but powerful, capturing their fears, frustrations, and hopes for change. Amelia saved the document, leaning back in her chair as a sense of release washed over her. It was a small step, but it was theirs. "We'll send it to Dr. Benson and the board tomorrow," Eric said, resting a hand on her shoulder. "This is just the beginning." Amelia reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And we'll see it through, For Benjamin and every family after us." The following morning dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. Amelia sat at the kitchen table, her gaze drifting to the window as the first flakes began to fall. The hum of the coffee maker provided a comforting backdrop as Eric finished printing the final copy of their letter. They sealed the envelope together, the significance of the act weighing on them both. It was more than just paper and ink. It was the first concrete step toward change. Eric met Amelia's eyes, his expression a blend of determination and caution. "I'll drop this off on my way to work." "Thank you," she said softly, her hand brushing his arm. "We're doing the right thing." He nodded, slipping the envelope into his bag. "I know." Hours passed with a slow, creeping anticipation. Amelia's phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends checking in, but none brought news about their complaint. She busied herself with Benjamin's care, trying to keep her mind from spinning into anxious thoughts. By mid-afternoon, Eric called. "I handed it to Dr. Benson personally," he said, his voice steady but edged with tension. "He said the board would review it and respond soon." Amelia exhaled, relief and nerves mingling in her chest. "That's good. Now we wait." 3 days later, an email from Dr. Benson arrived in their inbox, marked with the hospital's logo and a subject line that made Amelia's heart race. "Response to your concerns." Eric pulled a chair next to her as she clicked it open. The message was thorough and respectful. It acknowledged receipt of their formal complaint and outlined that the hospital board would be conducting a preliminary review. They promised updates as the investigation proceeded and assured Amelia and Eric that their experiences were taken seriously. "This is a start," Eric said, leaning back with a sigh. "They're listening." Amelia nodded, the tightness in her chest easing slightly. "It's more than I expected." Within the hospital, however, the response triggered a quiet ripple of unease. Catherine Shore's expression remained stoic as whispers reached her ears, subtle but unmistakable. The board's review meant more eyes on her methods, and she knew that change could challenge the authority she had maintained for years. Nora passed her in the hallway one afternoon, catching the shadow that crossed Catherine's face as she paused by the nurse's station. Their gazes met for a brief moment, and Nora's look was one of quiet resolve. Catherine's lips tightened, and she turned sharply on her heel, walking away without a word. 2 weeks into the board's review, Amelia received an unexpected call from Dr. Patel, a pediatrician she had only met briefly during Benjamin's birth. His voice was calm and thoughtful. "Mrs. Richards, I wanted to reach out because I read your letter," Dr. Patel began. "I hope you don't mind me calling." "Not at all," Amelia said, surprised but grateful. "Thank you for taking the time. I wanted you to know that I've spoken to Dr. Benson. There are many of us who support a more transparent approach and believe that parents should be fully included in their child's care. Your letter has sparked important conversations." Tears pricked Amelia's eyes. It was one thing to send a complaint. It was another to know it was being taken seriously by people who could affect change. "That means so much." "Thank you, Dr. Patel. Keep holding your ground," he said with gentle conviction. "You're making a difference." When Eric came home that evening, Amelia relayed the conversation. He listened with a growing sense of hope, a smile breaking across his face. "We're not just fighting alone anymore." The day of the board's first formal meeting regarding the complaint arrived. Amelia and Eric weren't required to attend, but they sat together on the living room couch, phones on the coffee table, waiting for any updates. At the hospital, Dr. Benson led the meeting, outlining the details of the Richards letter and the areas of concern. The board members, a mix of seasoned administrators and newer voices like Dr. Patel's, listened intently. Catherine Shore sat at one end of the long table, her hands clasped in her lap. Her face remained composed, but a hint of defensiveness sharpened her features. Dr. Patel spoke up, addressing the room. "It's clear that while procedures are in place for safety, the family's experiences highlighted a lack of empathetic communication. This is something we must address, not just for the Richards family, but for all our patients." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Catherine's jaw tightened, her eyes darting briefly to Dr. Benson, who nodded thoughtfully. We will conduct interviews and review procedures, Dr. Benson concluded. Transparency and trust must be the foundation of our care. Outside the meeting room, Nora passed by, catching snippets of conversation. She felt a small, quiet triumph bloom within her. Change was coming, and this time it felt real. That evening, Eric's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Benson. "We've begun a formal review. Your concerns are being addressed, and we will keep you informed." Eric read it aloud to Amelia, a sense of relief washing over both of them. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was shifting. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of weeks of tension slowly lifting. A knock at the door broke their reverie. It was Nora, bundled up against the evening chill, with a shy smile on her face. "I just wanted to tell you the meeting went well. You've got more people on your side than you think." Amelia's eyes welled with gratitude. "Thank you, Nora. We couldn't have done this without you." Nora shook her head. "No, it's you who reminded us all what really matters. Keeping families at the center of care. This is how change begins." The days following the board's announcement of a formal review were marked by a subtle but unmistakable shift within St. James Hospital. Conversations in the hallways were quieter, eyes were watchful, and staff exchanged looks that spoke of unasked questions and growing tension. Catherine Shore continued her work with the same methodical precision as always, but the edges of her composure had frayed. Her eyes narrowed as she passed Nora at the nurse's station, catching sight of the young nurse's confident posture. It was clear that alliances were forming, and the divide was becoming more visible. Dr. Patel, who had spoken out in the board meeting, found himself approached by other staff members, nurses, and doctors who offered quiet words of support. The growing awareness that the Richards family had sparked something significant resonated in the hospital's day-to-day atmosphere. Amelia, at home, felt the weight of waiting press on her. Every phone call and email were met with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Benjamin's soft gurgles and wide-eyed gazes were her anchors, reminders of why she and Eric had fought so hard. Eric was equally affected, balancing his work with constant updates from the hospital. One afternoon, he returned home with an unexpected piece of news. "Dr. Benson called me on my way back," Eric said, hanging his coat by the door. "He said they're interviewing staff members to gather more insight." Amelia's heart quickened. "That's a good sign, right? They're taking it seriously?" Eric nodded, though a trace of doubt lingered in his eyes. "It's a step, but it's hard to know how deep they'll dig. We need to stay prepared." Amelia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We will." Within the hospital, the review unfolded with formal interviews and meetings that took place behind closed doors. Staff members who worked closely with Catherine were asked to recount procedures and share their observations. Some hesitated, worried about repercussions, while others spoke candidly, emboldened by whispers of change. Nora sat across from Dr. Benson and two board members, her hands folded on her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking, recounting moments when she had seen patients' concerns brushed aside, or interactions marked by the rigid adherence to procedure rather than empathy. "I believe in structure," Nora said, choosing her words carefully, "but not at the cost of making parents feel powerless." "We can do better," Dr. Benson nodded, his eyes reflecting a thoughtful seriousness. "Thank you, Nora. Your insight is invaluable." Outside the office, Catherine walked past, the echo of her heels in the hallway punctuated by the murmur of voices. The hospital she had known for decades felt different now, shifting, questioning. The certainty she once commanded seemed to slip further from her grasp with each passing day. Back at the Richards house, the sound of Benjamin's laughter filled the living room as Amelia played with him, stacking blocks that he promptly knocked over with glee. The bright moment was interrupted by the familiar ping of an incoming email on her phone. Amelia glanced at the screen, her breath catching when she saw Dr. Benson's name. Eric, noticing her reaction, moved to her side, reading over her shoulder. "Mr. and Mrs. Richards, the board has concluded the initial phase of the review. We would like to invite you to meet and discuss the findings. Please let us know your availability for a meeting next week." Amelia looked up at Eric, a mix of apprehension and hope in her eyes. This could be it. We'll finally know what they found. Eric nodded, a small smile breaking through the tension. And we'll face it together. The following week, Amelia and Eric walked into the hospital's main building, their steps purposeful yet tentative. Dr. Benson greeted them in the hallway outside the conference room, his demeanor warm but professional. "Thank you for coming," he said, extending a hand. "This meeting is about transparency and discussing the steps we're committed to taking." They entered the room, where a few board members sat along with Dr. Patel and Nora, who offered an encouraging smile. Catherine was not present, a detail that did not go unnoticed by Amelia and Eric. Dr. Benson began, outlining the investigation's findings. "The board acknowledges that there were lapses in communication and procedural rigidity that impacted your experience. We're taking steps to ensure that patient interactions are improved, emphasizing empathy and collaboration." Amelia's heart lifted, but she held her breath as Dr. Patel continued. "We're also instituting new training for staff, focusing on parent engagement and clear communication. This will be the first of many changes aimed at fostering trust." Nora added, "Your letter highlighted the need for a shift, and we're committed to making that shift happen." The room was quiet for a moment as the weight of the words settled. Eric reached for Amelia's hand, their fingers lacing together in silent solidarity. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "This is what we hoped for, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." As the meeting concluded, Amelia and Eric walked through the hallways of St. James, their minds turning over the conversation. The changes weren't immediate solutions, but they were a start, a promise of progress. As they approached the exit, they saw Catherine standing at the nurse's station, her eyes meeting theirs for a brief moment. The look she gave them was unreadable, a mixture of defiance and something deeper. Perhaps acceptance. Eric turned to Amelia, noticing the way her shoulders relaxed, a sign of the weight lifting after weeks of tension. They stepped out into the crisp air, a sense of calm settling over them. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it," Amelia said, glancing down at Benjamin in his carrier. Eric smiled, the warmth of his expression radiating confidence. Together, the days after the meeting felt different, not only for Amelia and Eric, but for the staff at St. James Hospital. Conversations that had once been whispered grew louder, voices carrying hints of hope and curiosity. The changes announced by the board were met with a mix of enthusiasm and resistance. But the most noticeable shift was a sense of collective awareness. Nurses like Nora began to speak more freely, encouraging parents to ask questions and advocating for their presence during procedures. The atmosphere was gradually moving toward openness, and the hospital's motto of care, compassion, and collaboration was no longer just words on a plaque, but something that staff strove to embody. For Amelia, the sense of victory was subtle but present. She watched as other parents at follow-up appointments were engaged in conversations, their concerns met with warmth instead of formality. It was a stark contrast to the icy interactions that had defined her early days in the maternity ward. One afternoon, while waiting for a pediatric checkup for Benjamin, Amelia saw a young couple with their newborn, the father holding the baby as the mother asked a nurse a stream of questions. The nurse, a young man with a patient smile, answered each one without a hint of impatience. It was a small moment, but it resonated deeply. "Things really are changing," Amelia whispered to Eric, who sat beside her. He nodded, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Catherine Shore's presence at St. James grew quieter. She moved through the halls with her usual efficiency, but something had shifted. There was no denying the subtle way staff seemed to avoid her gaze, or how conversation stilled when she passed by. The reputation she had cultivated for decades now came with the weight of scrutiny. In her office, Catherine sat at her desk, the usual clutter of patient charts now perfectly arranged. The light from the window cast a harsh glow, highlighting the lines that worry had etched into her features. The board's review had not resulted in immediate disciplinary action, but the implications were clear: adapt or risk consequences. Despite her defensive nature, Catherine wasn't oblivious. She knew that the hospital had to evolve, And while she resented the challenge to her authority, she began to consider how she might reconcile her methods with the new expectations. Whether it was out of self-preservation or a deeper reckoning remained to be seen. Back at the Richards house, life was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. Benjamin's soft coos and curious glances became a daily reminder of why they had fought so fiercely. The tension that had dominated their home had been replaced by a cautious optimism. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching Benjamin play with a set of colorful blocks, Eric turned to Amelia. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" he asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. Amelia smiled, though it was tinged with the memory of those difficult early days. "All the time. I never imagined that speaking up would lead to this change that we can actually see." Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know. And now, it's not just about us. It's about other parents who won't have to go through what we did." They sat in a comfortable silence, the glow of the setting sun casting warm light across the room. The journey had been hard, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it had also revealed strength they hadn't known they possessed. A few weeks later, St. James Hospital held its first workshop focused on patient engagement and the role of empathy in medical care. Dr. Patel, now a vocal advocate for patient-centered practices, led the event, drawing staff from various departments. Amelia and Eric were invited as guest speakers to share their story, a testament to the power of advocacy and perseverance. The room was filled with doctors, nurses, and administrative staff, all listening intently as Amelia recounted the challenges they faced and the lessons learned. "We were scared, and we felt unheard," Amelia said, her voice steady but emotional. "But when we found people who stood by us, who believed that our voice mattered, everything changed. That's what we want for every family who walks through these doors." Nora, seated in the audience, nodded with a smile, her eyes glistening with pride. Catherine, who had reluctantly attended the workshop, sat near the back, her expression unreadable. But she stayed for the entire session, listening as voices that once seemed peripheral took center stage. Eric closed their portion with words that resonated with many. "We're all here because we care. And if we can make sure that care includes listening, we'll make St. James a place where every parent and patient feels seen and valued." The applause that followed was warm and genuine. For Amelia and Eric, it felt like closure. Not the end of their advocacy, but the start of something that would outlast their personal story. Later that evening, as they drove home, Amelia looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. The workshop had left her both exhausted and elated, a mix of emotions that lingered in her chest. Eric glanced at her and reached for her hand. "You okay?" he asked, squeezing gently. She turned to him, a smile breaking across her face. "More than okay. We did something good, Eric. We didn't just fight for Benjamin, we fought for every family that comes next." Eric's eyes softened, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "And we'll keep fighting whenever we need to." Amelia looked back at Benjamin, who had drifted off to sleep in his car seat, his tiny hand curled into a fist. The road ahead would have its challenges, but they were ready. Together, they had faced the storm and come out stronger, not just for themselves, but for everyone who needed to know that speaking up could make a difference. As they pulled into the driveway, the house seemed to glow with a new kind of light. A home not just defined by its walls, but by the love and resolve within it. The changes at St. James Hospital were gradual but unmistakable. New training sessions on communication and empathy became part of the regular schedule, encouraging staff to engage with patients and their families more meaningfully. The workshops, initially met with a mix of enthusiasm and skepticism, soon began to yield visible results. The energy in the hospital corridors shifted from one of routine formality to an atmosphere that carried more warmth and attentiveness. Nora noticed it most in the little things, the way nurses paused to explain a procedure in simpler terms, or how doctors took a few extra moments to address patients' concerns. It was a transformation that hadn't come without resistance, but it was taking root. For Catherine Shore, the adjustment was harder. The changes imposed new expectations that challenged her long-held practices. Yet, under the watchful eye of the board, and with Dr. Benson's support for new policies, she had no choice but to adapt. Slowly, the edges of her once rigid demeanor softened. She learned to listen more, though her steps were tentative, marked by an inner struggle between pride and acceptance. Back at home, life moved forward with a blend of normalcy and newfound purpose. Benjamin grew more curious by the day, his laughter filling the house and fueling Amelia and Eric's drive to ensure his future, and the futures of other children, would be supported by empathy and understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the living room in hues of gold, Amelia sat at her desk, drafting an article for a parenting magazine. The piece recounted their journey, focusing on the power of advocating for one's child and the strength found in community support. Eric entered the room with a grin, holding a framed certificate. "Look what came today," he said, setting it down in front of her. Amelia's eyes widened as she read it. An invitation for them to speak at a regional healthcare conference. The event would focus on improving patient and family experiences in medical settings, drawing professionals from across the state. "Eric, this is amazing," Amelia said, excitement and nerves fluttering in her chest. "It's another chance to share what we learned." He nodded, his eyes reflecting shared determination. "It's the perfect opportunity. We can keep the momentum going." The weeks leading up to the conference were busy. Between work, taking care of Benjamin, and refining their speech, Amelia and Eric found themselves navigating a new balance. Late nights were spent brainstorming how to convey their message in a way that would resonate beyond their personal experience. "Let's focus on the bigger picture," Eric suggested one night, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook filled with bullet points. "It's not just about what happened to us, but about how hospitals can empower families." Amelia nodded, tapping her pen against her chin. "And we should highlight the importance of allies like Nora and Dr. Patel. It's people like them who bridge the gap between policy and practice." They rehearsed together, fine-tuning their delivery until they felt confident. The preparation was exhausting, but it reminded them of how far they had come and why they started down this path in the first place. The day of the conference arrived with a crisp, cool morning. The venue bustled with attendees, nurses in scrubs, doctors in white coats, and healthcare administrators with name badges clipped to their blazers. Amelia felt a flutter of nerves as they walked into the auditorium, but Eric's steady presence beside her was reassuring. Their session was scheduled for mid-morning, and as they took the stage, a hush settled over the crowd. Dr. Patel sat in the front row, nodding in support, while Nora watched from a few rows back, pride in her eyes. Amelia began, her voice strong despite the nerves. "Our story is one of learning to trust our instincts and fight for our son, but it's also about the people who stood with us and the changes we witnessed because we spoke up." Eric followed, building on her words. "What we learned is that listening isn't just a skill, it's a responsibility. Healthcare is at its best when it respects not only the expertise of the medical team, but also the insights and concerns of families." The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others scribbled notes. When they finished, the room erupted in applause. Amelia felt a wave of relief and pride, knowing their voices had reached ears that mattered. The drive back home was filled with quiet conversation and moments of thoughtful silence. The trees lining the road were dusted with the first hints of spring, their branches stirring in the breeze. "That was more powerful than I imagined," Amelia said, glancing at Eric. "Hearing other people share their stories afterward, it reminded me that this is bigger than us." Eric reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "It is," and seeing Dr. Patel and Nora there, supporting us, it felt like closure, and a beginning at the same time. Amelia's heart swelled with gratitude. The road they'd traveled had been difficult, marked by moments of fear and resilience. But in standing up for Benjamin, they'd found not just their voices, but a community of advocates ready to make lasting changes. They pulled into their driveway, the house bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. Benjamin, now awake, was peering out of the window with wide eyes, a smile breaking across his face as he saw them. "Home," Eric said, squeezing her hand once more. "Home," Amelia echoed, stepping out of the car with a heart full of hope and a mindset on the future. Weeks turned into months, and the changes at St. James Hospital became more than just policy updates. They were part of a cultural shift. A new program was introduced called Family-Centric Care, emphasizing parents' involvement and enhancing communication between medical staff and patients. Workshops on empathetic listening and patient engagement became mandatory, led by staff members who had once been quiet voices in the background, but now stepped up with confidence. Nora was promoted to a lead nurse educator role, tasked with mentoring new nurses on these updated practices. Her compassionate approach and first-hand experience made her a natural fit. She often spoke of Amelia and Eric's story, using it as an example of why listening and partnership with families mattered. Even Dr. Patel took on more of a leadership role, working closely with Dr. Benson to monitor the effectiveness of the new training programs. He noted the positive feedback from both staff and patients, seeing firsthand how small changes in communication could build trust. Catherine Shore remained at the hospital, but with a quieter presence. She adapted, albeit reluctantly at first, and began participating in the workshops. While her transformation was slow, there were moments when even she demonstrated a newfound understanding. During one interaction, she caught herself explaining a procedure to a worried parent in more detail than she would have months prior. The shift in her approach, though subtle, reflected the ripple effects Amelia and Eric had set in motion. Amelia and Eric's advocacy didn't stop with their personal victory. They were invited to participate in community panels, local health events, and forums focused on patient rights and parental involvement in medical settings. Their story resonated with parents who had faced similar challenges but had felt powerless to speak up. Amelia began collaborating with local parent support groups, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to trust their instincts and voice their concerns. Eric, with his background in public relations, used his skills to help create informational guides that hospitals could distribute to new parents, detailing their rights and what they could expect during their hospital stay. One evening, after a panel discussion at a local community center, a mother approached Amelia with tears in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you," she said, holding Amelia's hand tightly. "Your story gave me the courage to ask more questions when my son was admitted last month. It made a difference." Amelia's heart swelled with emotion. These moments, these connections, were proof that what she and Eric had endured was not in vain. It was a reminder that their efforts had planted seeds of resilience and empowerment in others. A year after Benjamin's birth, Amelia and Eric received an invitation to visit St. James Hospital for a special event marking the anniversary of the Family-Centric Care program. They arrived on a bright spring day, Benjamin now toddling with unsteady steps and wide, curious eyes. The hospital lobby had changed since their last visit. Posters promoting family engagement and patient rights were displayed prominently. Staff members wore badges that read, "Here to listen." Dr. Benson greeted them warmly, accompanied by Nora and Dr. Patel. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, shaking Eric's hand. "Today is as much about celebrating you as it is about the program." As they moved through the hallways, familiar sights brought back memories, but they felt different now, tinged with hope instead of anxiety. Amelia saw young parents sitting with their babies, engaged in relaxed conversations with nurses who no longer wore expressions of hurried formality, but of genuine care. Catherine stood near the nurse's station, speaking with a young colleague. Her eyes met Amelia's, and there was a moment of mutual recognition. It wasn't warmth, but it was no longer the cold distance that had marked their first encounters. Catherine gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement that was enough. The event itself was modest, attended by hospital staff, community members, and families who had benefited from the new programs. Speeches were given, stories shared, and applause erupted when Dr. Patel spoke about the transformation that had taken root. Nora took the microphone, her voice strong yet emotional. "This past year has shown us that change isn't easy, but it is necessary. We owe that change to people like Amelia and Eric, who reminded us of what healthcare should stand for. Not just procedures, but people. Amelia felt tears well up, glancing at Eric, who squeezed her hand. It was surreal to be at the center of something that had grown beyond their initial fight for Benjamin's care. They had set out to protect their son, but ended up impacting so many more lives. After the event, Amelia and Eric stood outside, the sun casting a warm glow over the hospital that had been both a place of fear and now of hope. Benjamin toddled between them, his giggles filling the air. "We did it," Eric said softly, his eyes on their son. Amelia nodded, feeling the weight of their journey settle into a sense of peaceful pride. "Yes, we did. And we'll keep doing it, whatever it takes." The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but it led them to a place of resilience and unity. Not just for their family, but for others who would follow. They knew there would always be work to do, voices to uplift, and battles to face. But with each step, they'd move forward together, strengthened by what they had overcome. Amelia and Eric's story were one of resilience, advocacy, and the unwavering belief that their voice mattered. It inspired change at St. James Hospital and gave hope to countless families navigating their own challenges. Their journey reminded everyone that when people come together for a cause, progress follows. If you found inspiration in this story and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share stories that empower, uplift, and remind us all of the strength within our communities. Join us and never miss a tale that could inspire your own journey. Subscribe today to stay connected with powerful stories that highlight resilience, unity, and hope. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.